Sometimes life does not ask whether you are ready to face your past. It simply closes the door behind you and leaves you with no choice except to look into the eyes of the person you never truly forgot. I had boarded dozens of trains during the past 7 years, but none of them had ever changed my life. This one was supposed to be no different. I was traveling from Chicago to Boston after spending several days presenting the final design for a new public library project. My suitcase contained neatly organized blueprints, a laptop filled with unfinished sketches, and a return ticket scheduled for the following weekend. Everything about the trip had been carefully planned. Everything except the moment that waited behind the door of sleeper compartment 14. The conductor smiled politely as he handed me my ticket stub. He wished me a pleasant journey before continuing down the narrow hallway. I adjusted the strap of my backpack, took a slow breath, and slid the compartment door open without giving it another thought. The world seemed to stop moving before I even stepped inside. Sitting beside the window was Adrian Carter. For one impossible second, I convinced myself I was remembering a face instead of seeing one. The evening sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a warm glow across his neatly styled dark brown hair as he looked up from the book resting in his hands. His expression mirrored my own disbelief. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. 7 years disappeared in complete silence. The only sound came from the distant rhythm of steel wheels rolling beneath the train. Adrian slowly stood. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, not because age had changed him, but because experience had softened the sharp confidence that once surrounded him. There were faint lines near his eyes now, the kind earned through quiet responsibility rather than time alone. Even so, I recognized him immediately. Some faces never truly leave your memory. "Ethan," he finally said, barely above a whisper. Hearing my name in his voice felt strangely familiar, like hearing a song I had not realized I still remembered. I tightened my grip on the handle of my suitcase. Adrian. That single word carried everything we had never managed to say. I glanced toward the second bed, hoping I had entered the wrong compartment. My ticket clearly displayed the number. Compartment 14. Lower berth. There was no mistake. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket and quietly unfolded his own ticket. "Same compartment," he said with a small, almost uncertain smile. Before either of us could say another word, the conductor appeared once more behind me. "Is everything all right, folks?" he asked kindly. I forced a polite smile. "I think there has been a mistake." He checked both tickets carefully before shaking his head. "No mistake. The train is completely full tonight. You are both assigned here." My heart sank as the reality settled over me. There would be no switching seats, no requesting another room, and no escaping into another part of the train. The conductor wished us a pleasant evening once again before sliding the compartment door shut. The quiet click of the lock echoed louder than it should have. It felt less like a door closing and more like fate removing the last opportunity either of us had to walk away. Adrian looked toward the window for a brief moment before returning his attention to me. I never imagined we would meet like this. I let out a quiet breath that I had not realized I had been holding. Neither did I. Outside, Chicago slowly faded into the distance while the train gathered speed beneath the darkening sky. Inside the small compartment, there was barely enough room for 2 suitcases, 2 beds, and the countless memories neither of us had ever managed to leave behind. As the city lights disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized the journey ahead would not simply carry me to Boston. It was carrying me straight back to the one chapter of my life I had spent 7 years trying to forget. The train had barely cleared the outskirts of Chicago before an announcement echoed through the intercom, informing passengers that a mechanical inspection ahead would delay our arrival by nearly 2 hours. A quiet murmur spread through the cars, followed by the familiar sound of people adjusting travel plans they could no longer control. I glanced toward the window, watching the last traces of the city disappear behind us, while the evening sky slowly deepened into shades of blue and gold. Normally, I would have been annoyed by the delay. Tonight, it felt strangely insignificant compared to the person sitting only a few feet away. Adrian broke the silence first. "I guess we are going to be sharing this compartment longer than either of us expected." His voice carried a hint of dry humor, the same kind that had once made even difficult days seem manageable. I managed a small smile before looking away. Apparently, another quiet stretch settled between us, but this time it felt less uncomfortable than before. It felt uncertain, as though both of us were carefully searching for the safest place to begin after 7 years of absence. Adrian stood and reached for his jacket. "I am going to grab some coffee before the cafe car gets crowded. Would you like one?" The question caught me off guard because it sounded so ordinary. For a moment, it almost felt as though the years between us had never happened. "Sure," I answered. "Black, right?" he asked without hesitation. I looked at him in surprise. "You still remember?" A gentle smile crossed his face. "Some things are easier to remember than to forget." He disappeared into the hallway, leaving me alone with thoughts I had spent years trying to bury beneath work and routine. I had convinced myself that moving forward meant leaving the past untouched. Yet seeing Adrian again had uncovered memories I never realized were still waiting beneath the surface. A few minutes later, he returned carrying 2 paper cups. He handed one to me exactly the way he used to, careful not to spill a single drop. I wrapped both hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to focus on besides my own racing thoughts. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded before sitting across from me. "So," he asked after another moment, "are you still designing public buildings?" I looked up. "Mostly libraries and community centers now. I like creating places where people actually spend time together." Adrian smiled with genuine interest. "That sounds exactly like you." I laughed softly. "What is that supposed to mean?" "You always cared more about people than recognition." His answer came so naturally that I almost forgot we had not spoken in 7 years. "And you?" I asked. "Still working for that architecture firm in New York?" He shook his head. "Not anymore. I left corporate design a few years ago. I teach architecture at a university in Boston now." "Teaching?" I repeated, unable to hide my surprise. I never imagined that. He looked down at his coffee before answering. "Neither did I. But somewhere along the way I realized I enjoyed helping students build their future more than chasing another promotion." I studied him carefully. The ambitious young man I had once known had become someone quieter, steadier, and somehow more genuine. Outside the window, the train rolled past small towns where porch lights flickered beneath the fading sky. Inside our compartment, the conversation gradually found its own rhythm. We spoke about ordinary things that somehow felt extraordinary simply because we were sharing them with each other. Cities we had visited, projects we were proud of, favorite books, new hobbies, small pieces of 2 separate lives that had unfolded without the other. Every answer quietly erased another layer of awkwardness. Then Adrian looked at me with an expression I could not immediately read. "Do you ever think about Madison?" he asked softly. The question settled over the compartment with unexpected weight. Madison had not simply been a city. It had been the place where everything between us had once felt possible. I stared into my coffee, watching the surface ripple gently with the movement of the train, and realized that some destinations never truly disappear, no matter how many miles separate you from them. For several long seconds I said nothing. The gentle movement of the coffee inside my paper cup seemed easier to follow than the memories Adrian had quietly uncovered with a single question. Madison had been where we dreamed about our future together while we were still architecture students. It had been the city where every small street, every neighborhood cafe, and every walk along the lakeshore had convinced us that life would always feel that simple. I finally looked up and met his eyes. More often than I admitted to myself, I answered honestly. Adrian gave a small nod as though he had expected that answer. "Me too." The train continued east through the growing darkness while scattered lights from quiet Midwestern towns drifted past the windows like distant stars. Neither of us seemed interested in looking at our phones or opening our laptops. Somehow the outside world had become much less important than the conversation unfolding inside a compartment that suddenly felt suspended between the past and the present. Adrian rested his coffee on the small folding table and smiled faintly. "Do you remember that little bookstore near the Capitol?" I laughed before I could stop myself. "The one where you spent an hour pretending you were looking for architecture books, even though you were actually trying to surprise me with that poetry collection?" His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You knew?" "I knew the moment you kept walking back to the same shelf." He shook his head and laughed quietly. "I thought I had been subtle. You never were." The ease of that exchange caught both of us off guard. For just a brief moment, it felt as though we had stepped backward through time instead of forward. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, shaped by shared memories rather than uncertainty. Adrian leaned back against his seat. I still have that bookstore receipt. I stared at him. You kept it. It was inside the book when I packed everything after graduation. I never threw it away. My fingers tightened around the warm coffee cup. I still have the book. His expression softened. You do? It has been sitting on the top shelf in my apartment all these years. Neither of us smiled this time. The realization settled quietly between us that we had both carried pieces of the same story without ever knowing the other had done exactly the same. Outside, the train crossed a wide river, and moonlight shimmered across the water in long silver lines. Passengers moved softly through the hallway, but inside our compartment, everything remained calm. And still, Adrian looked toward the window before speaking again. Do you ever wonder how different life might have been? I considered the question carefully before answering. Sometimes, but wondering never changed anything. He nodded. I used to imagine running into you somewhere. An airport, a conference, even a grocery store. I smiled gently. A train was probably the last place either of us expected. That sounds about right. We both laughed, and this time the laughter felt genuine. It was not loud or dramatic. It was simply two people discovering that time had not erased every familiar part of who they once were. After another quiet moment, Adrian reached into his travel bag and searched for something. He hesitated briefly before pulling out a neatly folded blue scarf. He held it carefully in both hands without saying a word. I recognized it instantly. Years earlier, I had chosen that color because I thought it matched his eyes on cold winter mornings. I looked at the scarf, then back at him, unable to hide my surprise. Adrian met my gaze with quiet honesty. Some things, he said softly, never stopped feeling like home. For a long time, neither of us spoke after Adrian unfolded the blue scarf. I could still remember the winter afternoon when I had wrapped it around his neck outside the university library, because he had forgotten his coat again. Back then, we believed small moments would last forever. Looking at that same scarf now, carefully preserved after 7 years, made it impossible to pretend that the past had disappeared. I smiled faintly before opening my backpack. Adrian watched with quiet curiosity as I reached into a small zippered pocket and carefully removed a worn brass compass keychain. Time had dulled its shine, but the engraved initials on the back remained perfectly clear. Adrian stared at it in disbelief. You kept it, he whispered. I slowly nodded. You gave it to me before my first internship. You said every architect needed something to remind him that buildings always began with finding the right direction. He let out a soft laugh that carried equal parts happiness and regret. I cannot believe you still have it. I turned, the small compass in my hand, watching it catch the warm light inside the compartment. I never had a reason to throw it away. Before Adrian could answer, the train conductor announced that the observation car had reopened after the mechanical inspection. Hoping for a change of scenery, we decided to stretch our legs. The observation car was quieter than expected. Only a handful of passengers sat near the wide panoramic windows, watching the moonlight shimmer across rivers and distant fields. Adrian and I found 2 empty seats beside the glass. For several peaceful minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the landscape drift past beneath the stars, letting the steady rhythm of the train fill the silence. A cheerful elderly couple soon approached with warm smiles. Would you boys mind taking our picture? The woman asked kindly. Adrian accepted their phone and happily captured several photographs while I watched them laugh together. After thanking us, the husband looked at both of us with friendly amusement. Now it is your turn, he said. Every couple deserves a picture during a train adventure. Adrian and I instinctively looked at each other before either of us could respond. Neither of us corrected the misunderstanding. Instead, we stood beside the window while the elderly woman lifted her phone and smiled warmly. Come a little closer, she encouraged. Without thinking, we stepped nearer until our shoulders almost touched. The camera captured the moment in a single quiet click. When she handed the phone back, she smiled with genuine affection. You two have the kind of smiles that only appear when people have known each other for a very long time. Her words lingered long after she and her husband returned to their seats. Adrian looked out at the passing darkness before speaking almost to himself. Maybe they noticed something we forgot to see. I followed his gaze toward the reflection in the glass. Instead of seeing 2 strangers sharing the same train compartment, I saw 2 people carrying the same unanswered story. After another long silence, Adrian finally turned toward me. His expression had become more serious than at any point since the journey began. "Ethan," he said quietly, "there has always been one question I never stopped asking myself." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "What question?" He lowered his eyes for only a moment before meeting mine again. "If neither of us wanted to leave, then what really happened to us?" Adrian's question lingered between us long after the words had been spoken. The observation car suddenly felt quieter than before, as though even the steady rhythm of the train had softened to make room for an answer neither of us had been brave enough to search for until now. I looked out at the endless stretch of moonlit fields before speaking. "I always believed you changed your mind," I admitted. "The day after graduation, you stopped answering my calls. Your apartment was empty. Your office said you had accepted a position in New York. I thought that was your way of saying goodbye." Adrian stared at me in complete disbelief. "Ethan, I called you every day for almost 2 weeks." I slowly shook my head. "I never received a single call." His expression shifted from confusion to genuine concern. "That cannot be right." Before either of us could continue, the train gradually slowed as it approached a scheduled stop in Toledo. The platform outside was softly illuminated, and several passengers stepped off to stretch their legs during the brief stop. Adrian glanced toward the window. "Would you like some fresh air?" I nodded, grateful for a moment to gather my thoughts. We stepped onto the platform, where the cool evening breeze carried the scent of rain from somewhere in the distance. The station was peaceful, with only a handful of travelers wandering between the small cafe and the waiting area. As Adrian and I stood quietly beside the train, I heard someone call his name. "Adrian, is that really you?" We turned at the same time. Walking toward us with a surprised smile was a man I recognized almost immediately despite the passing years. Daniel Mercer. He had studied architecture with both of us in Madison and had always been the easiest person in our class to talk to. "Daniel," Adrian said with a laugh as they shook hands. Daniel greeted me just as warmly before looking back and forth between us with obvious surprise. "I cannot believe you two are together again after everything that happened." Adrian and I exchanged a confused glance. "What do you mean?" I asked. Daniel frowned. "Wait, do not tell me neither of you ever found out." A strange silence settled over the three of us. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking uncertain. "I honestly thought someone would have explained it years ago." Adrian took a slow breath. "Explained what?" Daniel looked at both of us carefully before answering. "Melissa admitted the truth a long time ago." My heart skipped. Melissa had been one of our classmates and someone both Adrian and I had trusted without question. She confessed that she lied to both of you. I felt the air leave my lungs. Daniel continued gently. "She told Ethan that Adrian had accepted the New York job because he wanted a fresh start without him. Then she told Adrian that Ethan had already decided to move to Seattle with another firm and did not want a long-distance relationship. She even claimed each of you asked her to deliver the message because it would make the breakup easier." Adrian looked completely stunned. "I never said any of that." "Neither did I whispered. Daniel nodded sadly. "I know. She admitted everything at our 5-year reunion. She said she had convinced herself that separating you was somehow helping both of you focus on your careers. She regretted it almost immediately, but by then neither of you was speaking to anyone from school anymore." I could barely process what I had just heard. 7 years of unanswered questions suddenly collapsed beneath a truth neither of us had ever imagined. The train whistle echoed across the platform, signaling that passengers should return aboard. Adrian slowly turned toward me, his eyes filled not with anger, but with quiet heartbreak. For the first time since we had met again, we both understood that our story had never ended because love had disappeared. It had ended because two people who trusted each other had unknowingly believed the same terrible lie. The ride back to our compartment felt completely different from every mile we had traveled before. Neither Adrian nor I spoke as we walked through the narrow hallway, but the silence no longer came from uncertainty. It came from the overwhelming realization that 7 years of distance had been built on words neither of us had ever spoken. Once the compartment door closed behind us, I sat on the lower berth and stared at the brass compass resting in my hand. The tiny needle continued pointing north with perfect confidence. I wondered how many years I had spent searching for direction while carrying something that had known where it belonged all along. Adrian remained standing near the window for a few moments before quietly breaking the silence. "I wrote you 18 letters after I moved to New York." I slowly looked up. Letters. He nodded. I mailed every one of them to the apartment where you lived during our last semester. Every week, I hoped you would answer. I felt my chest tighten. I moved out 2 days after graduation because my internship started earlier than expected. The building was being renovated, so they closed the mailbox almost immediately. Adrian lowered his eyes with a sad smile. Then you never saw them. No, I answered softly. I never knew they existed. He reached into his wallet and carefully unfolded a faded photograph that had clearly been opened countless times over the years. It showed the two of us standing beside the lake in Madison after presenting our final studio project. We were smiling without hesitation, completely certain that the future was waiting for us together. I carried this everywhere, Adrian admitted. Every apartment, every office, every lecture hall. I reached into my backpack once again and pulled out an old leather notebook. Tucked safely between its pages was a pressed maple leaf that had turned deep crimson with age. Adrian recognized it immediately. The park, he whispered. I nodded. The afternoon you said every great building begins with a strong foundation. He smiled gently. And you answered that every lasting relationship does too. We both laughed quietly, amazed by how vividly we remembered conversations that had happened nearly a decade earlier. Time had changed our careers, our cities, and our daily routines, but it had not erased the moments that had shaped who we became. Outside the window, the first hints of dawn began to soften the horizon with pale shades of blue. The long night that had started with disbelief was slowly giving way to morning. Adrian sat beside me, leaving enough space to respect the years that had separated us while somehow feeling closer than he had all evening. I spent a long time blaming myself, he admitted. I thought I had failed you because I could not convince you to stay. I shook my head, and I believed you had chosen ambition over us. He looked directly into my eyes. I never stopped choosing you, Ethan. I just believed you had already chosen a different life. Emotion caught in my throat, but this time it was not regret alone. It was relief. Relief that the love we had mourned had never truly disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath misunderstanding and silence. The train announcement informed passengers that Boston was now less than 1 hour away. For the first time since boarding, neither of us seemed eager for the journey to end. Adrian took a slow breath before offering a warm, hopeful smile. When we arrive, I do not want to pretend this conversation never happened. I returned the smile without hesitation. Neither do I. He extended his hand across the small space between us, not as someone trying to reclaim the past, but as someone asking for the chance to build something honest from this moment forward. I looked at his hand for only a second before placing mine in it, realizing that sometimes the longest journey is not measured in miles, but in finding the courage to trust the truth when it finally arrives. Morning sunlight gradually filled the compartment as the train crossed the final stretch of countryside before Boston. The golden light reflected across the window, replacing the darkness that had surrounded us only a few hours earlier. It felt strangely symbolic. The night had been filled with unanswered questions, while the morning offered something neither of us had expected to find again. Hope. Adrian slowly released my hand, not because the moment had ended, but because it no longer needed words to prove it was real. We sat beside each other watching the quiet landscape pass by until he broke the silence with a gentle smile. Do you remember the promise we made during our last semester? I smiled almost immediately. The one about visiting every building we designed together after 10 years. He laughed softly. I cannot believe you remember that. I remember almost everything. His expression softened. So do I. We spent the next several minutes talking about the years we had missed. Instead of focusing on what had been taken from us, we found ourselves sharing the lives we had quietly built. I told him about the neighborhood library in Chicago where children filled every reading room after school, and how hearing their laughter always reminded me why I became an architect. Adrian described the excitement of watching first-year students discover that every great design started with listening before drawing. We realized that although our careers had taken different paths, they had been shaped by the same values we once dreamed about together. Eventually, Adrian reached into his travel bag once more. There is something else I never stopped carrying. He carefully removed a small envelope, its edges softened by time. I wrote this during my first month in New York. It was the last letter I mailed. He handed it to me without hesitation. The envelope had never been opened because it had never reached me. I gently unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was unmistakably his. The words were simple. He wrote that every success felt incomplete because the person he wanted to celebrate with was no longer beside him. He wrote that he hoped one day we would meet again, even if it was only to clear away the misunderstanding he could never explain. At the very end, he had written one sentence that made my vision blur with emotion. Wherever life takes us, I hope kindness leads you home. I carefully folded the letter and handed it back. You should keep it, Adrian said quietly. I shook my head. No, it belongs with you. He smiled warmly before placing the letter into my notebook beside the preserved maple leaf instead. Now it belongs to both of us. The announcement for Boston South Station interrupted the peaceful silence. Passengers began gathering their belongings while the train gradually slowed. I looked around the compartment that had once felt impossibly small. Somehow it had become the place where years of misunderstanding had quietly unraveled. Adrian stood and lifted my suitcase before I could reach for it. Some habits never disappear, I said with a smile. I hope not, he replied. We stepped into the hallway together, joining the steady line of travelers waiting to leave the train. Through the windows, I could already see the familiar skyline growing closer. Adrian looked toward me with calm certainty instead of hesitation. I know we cannot recover 7 years. I nodded. Neither can I. He smiled gently. But we do not have to spend another 7 wondering what might have happened. The train eased into the station with one final quiet movement. As the doors opened, I realized neither of us was walking toward an ending. We were simply stepping into a future that had finally been given the chance to begin honestly. One choice, one conversation, and one shared step at a time. The platform slowly filled with travelers hurrying toward taxis, waiting families, and the familiar rhythm of another busy morning in Boston. Yet neither Adrian nor I seemed interested in rushing anywhere. For the first time in years, neither of us had somewhere more important to be than the conversation we had finally begun. We walked side by side through the station until we reached the main entrance, where the cool morning air welcomed us beneath a clear blue sky. Adrian glanced toward a small cafe across the street before looking back at me. Would you have breakfast with me? He asked. There was no pressure hidden inside the invitation. No expectation that 7 years could be erased over a single meal. It was simply an honest question from someone hoping to learn who I had become instead of trying to recreate who I used to be. I smiled. I would like that. The cafe overlooked the harbor, where sunlight reflected across the water in bright ribbons of silver. We found a quiet table near the window, ordered coffee and fresh pastries, and for the first time the conversation no longer centered on what had gone wrong. Instead, we talked about what mattered now. Adrian described the students who challenged him to think differently every semester, laughing as he shared stories about ambitious first-year designers who believed every impossible idea could somehow become reality. I told him about the neighborhood children who proudly pointed at libraries I had designed and called them their favorite places after school. We discovered that despite living separate lives, we had both chosen careers devoted to helping other people build brighter futures. Adrian stirred his coffee thoughtfully before speaking again. Last night, I kept wondering whether we should try to go back to where we left off. I listened quietly as he continued. This morning, I realized that is the wrong question. We are not the same people we were at 22. Maybe we should simply get to know each other again. I felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over me. I was thinking exactly the same thing. We smiled at the coincidence. There was something comforting about beginning without pretending the years had never happened. We finished breakfast slowly, taking our time because neither of us wanted to force the moment into something larger than it needed to be. Before leaving the cafe, Adrian reached into his pocket and handed me a simple business card with his university office number written neatly on the back in blue ink. This is not because I expect anything, he said. It is because I never want us to lose contact again. I accepted the card before writing my personal phone number beneath his. Then here is mine. No intermediaries this time. Adrian laughed warmly. That sounds like a much better plan. Outside, we walked together toward the subway entrance where our paths would temporarily separate. I had meetings scheduled across the city before returning to Chicago the following afternoon, while Adrian had an afternoon lecture waiting for him on campus. We stopped at the top of the station stairs and looked at each other with quiet understanding. There was no dramatic farewell and no promise that everything would instantly become perfect. Instead, Adrian extended his hand once again. "Dinner tonight?" he asked with a hopeful smile. I shook my head gently, causing his expression to briefly fall before I smiled back. "Not dinner tonight." He looked puzzled until I continued. "Dinner tomorrow. I am changing my return flight, so neither of us has to rush the beginning of something worth taking seriously." His smile returned brighter than the morning sunlight surrounding us. "I think that is the best change of plans either of us has ever made." As we headed in different directions for the first time since the train arrived, I realized we were no longer walking away from each other. We were simply taking the first careful steps toward meeting again, this time with honesty, patience, and the quiet confidence that the strongest foundations are built one day at a time. 1 year later, I stood on the same train platform in Chicago with a familiar overnight ticket resting in my hand. The station looked almost exactly as it had the year before. Travelers hurried toward departing trains. Conductors called final boarding announcements, and rolling suitcases echoed across the polished floor. Everything appeared unchanged, yet I knew I was not the same person who had walked through those doors 12 months earlier carrying nothing but quiet regret. My phone vibrated with a simple message. "I am already in compartment 14. Do not make me drink both coffees by myself." I smiled before slipping the phone back into my pocket. Some traditions deserved to continue. As I opened the compartment door, Adrian looked up from the window with the same warm smile that had become the most familiar part of my life again. "You are 2 minutes late," he teased. I laughed as I placed my suitcase beside the lower berth. "That is because I stopped to buy something." I handed him a small paper bag from the bakery inside the station. He opened it and immediately laughed. "The cinnamon rolls from Madison." I nodded. I remembered they finally opened a location in Chicago. Adrian looked genuinely impressed. "You still remember my favorite." I plan to keep remembering. The train slowly pulled away from the platform, beginning another journey toward Boston, but this trip felt entirely different from the first one. There was no awkward silence waiting between us, no unanswered questions hiding beneath ordinary conversation. Over the past year, we had visited each other almost every month, celebrated completed projects together, explored neighborhoods in both cities, and learned that rebuilding trust was not accomplished through one grand gesture, but through countless ordinary days filled with honesty. Adrian often spent weekends in Chicago helping me photograph historic buildings, while I traveled to Boston to attend student exhibitions at the university where he taught. Somewhere along the way, our second chance had quietly become our everyday life. As the train settled into its steady rhythm, Adrian reached into his travel bag and removed a flat envelope. "I have been waiting to give this to you." Curious, I opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph taken by the elderly woman we had met in the observation car a year earlier. She had somehow managed to send it to Adrian after he tracked down the train company through an online travel group. In the picture, we stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the wide observation windows, both smiling with the uncertainty of two people who had no idea their lives were about to change forever. On the back, she had written a short note in careful handwriting. "Sometimes strangers recognize hope before we do." I looked at the photograph for a long moment before carefully placing it inside my notebook beside the preserved maple leaf and Adrian's old letter. Those small keepsakes no longer represented what we had lost. They reminded us of everything we had chosen to rebuild. Adrian gently took my hand as we watched the evening sun settle beyond the horizon. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had not boarded the same train?" he asked quietly. I considered the question before smiling. "Sometimes. But I have stopped living in the version of life that never happened." He nodded with peaceful understanding. "So have I." Outside the window, the tracks stretched endlessly ahead beneath the fading sky, carrying us toward another city, another weekend, and countless ordinary tomorrows we once believed had been taken from us forever. I realized that love was never truly measured by dramatic moments or perfect timing. It was measured by the quiet decision to choose the same person again after life had given both of you every reason to walk away. As the lights inside the train grew warmer and the night settled gently around us, I rested my head against the window with complete peace in my heart, grateful that the journey which had once reopened an old chapter had ultimately become the road that finally led both of us home.